All right, everybody, good evening. I'm delighted to see so many people here in the room and to everybody joining us on Zoom as well. I don't know where to look for the camera, but welcome and thank you for joining us also. Welcome to this event co-hosted by the Royal Asiatic Society and the Indian Art Circle. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Mahreen Shida Razvi, and I'm the Honorary Secretary of the Indian Art Circle. Alison Ota, the director of the Royal Asiatic Society, unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. She's in Jeddah for the end of the Biennale, but she might be joining us online if she's able to. But I know she sends her best as well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, a good friend and colleague, Yael Rice. Yael Rice is an associate professor of art history and of Asian languages and civilizations at Amherst College. She specializes in the arts and architecture of South Asia, Central Asia, and Iran, with a particular focus on manuscripts and other portable arts of the 15th through 18th centuries. She's the author of Books That Bind, the Persianate Album and its widespread circulation, in the new publication, Old Stacks, New Leaves, The Arts of the Book in South Asia, edited by Sonal Khular, and just published by the University of Washington Press. And also the author of Art History Beyond Objects, published in Art Journal Online in January of this year. And that is on digital humanities approaches to the teaching of art history. With Dipti Khera, she is co-editor of Readings on Paintings from 75 Years of Marg, to be published later this year. Her work has been supported by a number of grants and fellowships, including a College Art Association Millard Mace publication grant, an American Institute of Indian Studies NEH Senior Long-Term Fellowship, and a 3-year Mellon Fellowship in Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School, University of Virginia. She's also a recipient of a Persian Heritage Foundation academic institution grant to fund the digitization of the Taza Akhbar, an illustrated early 18th century Persian language history of the Durrani kings of Afghanistan, now in the Amherst College Library's archives and special collections. She is an exceptional scholar, and her book, The Brush of Insight, Artists and Agency at the Mughal Court, which is released today in the US, so unfortunately we don't actually have copies with us. But this book has been eagerly awaited by all of us interested in Mughal artists, book production, and intellectual culture. I'm delighted she's able to be with us in person to share aspects of this new work. And on behalf of both the RIS and the IAC, I now welcome her to the podium. Yeah.
Thank you, Mahreen, for that lovely introduction. I'm grateful to you, to the Indian Art Circle and the Royal Asiatic Society for hosting this event. I also want to extend my thanks to Maddie Bradley for handling all the logistics online, behind the scenes, everything that entails. I have many thanks to express, but I guess that's what acknowledgement sections of books are for. So it's all in there. I did just want to mention one person, and that is Kathy Asher, who very sadly passed just a few weeks ago. Many of you will know her scholarship, which was exceptional and path-breaking in the field of art history, in the field of the art and architecture of Mughal South Asia. But as some of you will know, she was also just an extremely beyond measure generous person, and would extend her generosity to peers, to younger scholars alike. And I was the recipient on many occasions of that generosity. And I only regret that I can't deliver this book to her in person. So with that, let me begin. The Brush of Insight is about the constellation of agents and institutions that shape the perception of the Mughal emperor's preeminence in all spheres of dominion, temporal and sacred, during the reigns of Akbar and his son and successor, Jahangir, and the fundamental role that manuscript painters in particular played in enhancing it. A well-known painting of Jahangir, very well-known, seated on an hourglass throne, underscores the potent currency that paintings made specifically for books possessed, as it depicts the emperor presenting a manuscript to a turbaned and white-bearded figure, probably meant to represent a Sufi of the Chishti lineage. The manuscript's decorated binding and clasps are finely detailed. Even the foredge is crisply defined. Vichitra, the court artist who created this work, extended this descriptive treatment to the rest of the painting. From the representation of Jahangir's stitched robe and side locks, to the tiny feet of the angels who inscribe a blessing on the hourglass below. In depicting his subject so comprehensively, Vichitra may persuade us that he witnessed this marvelous and impossible vision firsthand, but the Mughal manuscript's painter's objective was not to depict exactly what he saw, but to portray the earthly and cosmic realms as perceived through a heuristic lens that was or appeared to be the emperor's rather than his own. The many Mughal portraits produced in the late 16th and early 17th centuries should be similarly understood as attempts to manifest the emperor's superior discernment as the primary register of pictorial representation. These acts hinged on the notion that the Mughal dynasts alone possessed the perceptual and intellectual faculties to discern the truths about the phenomenal and metaphysical worlds, and ultimately to bring order to them. The artistic project to re-envision the cosmos according to a distinctively Mughal imperial worldview was predicated on a legal doctrine first articulated centuries prior that identified independent inquiry, tahqiq, rather than imitation of tradition, taqlid, as the surest way to uncover divinity's definitudes. The catastrophic Mughal invasions of the 13th century provided the conditions for the emergence of a universalist paradigm that drew upon Shi'i, Sufi, Mongol, and Hermetic bodies of thought and practice. The new dispensation invested charismatic rulers to whom their ideologues often attributed mystical knowledge and occult abilities with unconditional power and authority. During the 1580s, Akbar's ideologues advanced similar claims about Mughal sovereignty. Akbar took the title of renewer of the second millennium, a reference to the impending close of Islam's first 1,000 years. A decree or masar issued in 1579 heralded Akbar as a mujtahid, that is, one capable of formulating legal doctrine independent of or exclusive of tradition. Liberated from the constraints of precedent, the Mughal imperial machine pursued an ambitious search for truth, foregrounding independent investigation, mystical matters, and novel subjects, while identifying Akbar as a sacred sovereign in both body and intellect. The formation in 1582 of a practice of discipleship centered on the body of the emperors codified these political and ideological shifts. This devotional cult was modeled directly on the Sufi silsila or lineage, though it also drew on the solar rituals and motifs of sacred kingship in the Zoroastrian and Hindu traditions. Royal painters, some of whom enjoyed membership in this exclusive discipleship, represented Akbar and his successor, Jahangir, as examiners of the natural and celestial realms, and thus as discoverers of truth by depicting the objects of the imperial real and imagined gaze in painstaking detail, as here in Vichitra's painting. The Mughal painter's intricate studies not only compel the viewer to linger on the page, to attempt to take in the abundance of minutiae, but they also invite her to contemplate the superior intellectual and corporeal powers, the emperor's own, of course, that made possible this profound apprehension of the subject. The painter's enterprise was clearly a success, for the perception that Akbar and Jahangir were the ultimate sources of all pictorial expression has long prevailed in both the popular and the scholarly imaginations. Studies that have recognized the contributions of manuscript painters, meanwhile, have tended to focus on a small number of quote unquote, master painters as the actualizers of the emperor's artistic inventions. Chapter 2, entitled Workshop and Empire, the Invention of the Mughal Painter, examines the role that embodied processes played in the formation of a corporate court artist, at once painter, bureaucrat, and disciple around the end of the 16th century. Pierre Bourdieu's insistence on the social and ultimately collective foundations of identity, combined with digital humanities methods, namely social network analysis, provide entrees to perceiving Mughal workshop painters not strictly as autonomous individuals, but as constituent members of and thus contributors to a larger networked court society. Becoming a Mughal artist, this chapter argues, entailed not only the attainment of artistic skills, but also the assumption of a self characterized by a certain kind of ethical disposition and collective agency. Chapter 3, Forms of Knowledge, the Emperor's Body and the Artist's Brush, examines a new kind of portraiture that imperial painters innovated during the latter part of Akbar's reign. It drew heavily from the science of physiognomy, or ilm el-firasa, whose central premise is that facial and other external bodily features are an index of inner character. Portraits, in this sense, gained or obtained value as epistemic objects. But the portraits of the emperors that Mughal painters made did not exist only in books. They enjoyed far more physically and socially enmeshed lives in the form of stamped gold coins that the emperors presented to their disciples and others to wear as talismans on their turbans and around their necks, as we see depicted here in this early 17th century manuscript illustration. Painted portraits very clearly provided the templates for these tokens. I've actually provided the dimensions here. And interestingly, in this tiny, tiny portrait of Jahangir that is today housed in the Cleveland Museum of Art, the dimensions of Jahangir's face map directly onto the dimensions on the coin itself. Tiny images. The distribution of the imperial likeness was far-reaching. Sir Thomas Roe, the English ambassador, in residence at Jahangir's court between 1615 and 19, claimed to have received one of these portrait coins. Royal painters thus advanced a conception of the Mughal body as a source of spiritual knowledge and healing, a phenomenon with both local and global resonances. It was in the context of the album codex, or muraka, meaning patched or mended, that Mughal manuscript painting's multiple potentialities were most fully realized. A now fragmentary album known interchangeably as the Gulshan or Jahangir album bears the material traces of these designs. Containing portraits, calligraphic specimens, and European engravings, the album also includes paintings with inscriptions that identify them as presentation pieces, Amal-i-Nowruz, made for the occasion of Nowruz, the Persian New Year. As chapter 4, World in a Book, explains, these works functioned as the royal painters' contributions to the multi-day Nowruz celebrations, which also coincided, of course by design, with the Mughal emperor's accession anniversaries. These painterly gifts added to the Jahangir album a critical temporal and ritual dimension. They simultaneously embedded the royal painter in this momentous, multi-layered book collection. For the remainder of this talk, I'd like to present a selection from chapter 1, Inner Visions, Fragments from the Unseen World, which covers the years 1615 to 1620, when Jahangir's court artists produced a significant corpus of manuscript paintings that purported to depict the emperor's dreams. We begin with one evening around 1615, when, while sleeping directly over a sacred spring on the outskirts of Ajmer, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir reportedly had a dream in which he encountered his rival, the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas I. Neither the experience of the dream nor its subsequent transmission in a book is unusual. Royalty, Jahangir's forebears included, often claimed to be visited by portentous dreams, some of which would be recorded in official texts. In this case, however, it was a member of the Mughal manuscript atelier's staff of painters who documented the emperor's image. The artist brought to life in vivid colors and gold leaf the world of images, the alam al-mithal, that intermediary zone between God and man in which dreams take shape, but not substance. In the painting, Jahangir subsumes Shah Abbas in an embrace as both stand on a European terrestrial globe. Each is supported by an animal, Jahangir by a lion, Shah Abbas by a lamb. The artist Abul Hassan made the important decision to place the lion's recumbent body over not only Mughal Hindustan, but Iran too, including the Safavid capital of Isfahan. The beast's chest blankets the strategic zone between Kandahar and Kabul, over which the Safavids and Mughals fought for much of the later 16th into the 17th century. Depicting the scene within the context of an imperial dream, the artist effectively transmuted his patron's mundane territorial claims into cosmic prerogatives. This painting belongs to a small group of imperial portraits that claim to depict Jahangir's dreams and visions, and that represent the emperor as a spiritual sovereign who receives messages from God. The representation of uncommon forms in the dream paintings, an English portrait of James I, European terrestrial globes, and owls, to name only a few, brought the imaginary realms into the everyday reality of paint on paper, while, as in the case of these pendant portraits, the movement across the codex's gutter or inner margins from one page to another and from one dream painting to the next charted the journey between the celestial and earthly spheres. Interceding between God and Jahangir, the royal and divine kingdoms, and the earthly and celestial realms, the Mughal painter here functions as the mu'abbir, or dream interpreter, who connects the dream's sensory form, or surat, to its inner meaning, or mani. As if to forestall any question regarding its origins, Abul Hassan's painting tells us that its source is a dream. And it does this through a couplet of poetry voiced in the first person, that is the emperor's voice, inscribed in black ink above the two rulers' heads. It reads, "Our Shah came in a dream and then made me happy. An enemy of my dream is he who awakened me." An inscription copied in the upper left and right corners of the composition, voiced in the third person, notes that Jahangir composed these lines of poetry after he witnessed the content of the painting in a dream, while sleeping near Chashme-an-Nur, a sacred spring located on the outskirts of Ajmer in today's Rajasthan. Paragraphs at the lower left explain that because Abul Hassan had not seen Shah Abbas in the flesh, by the way, neither did Jahangir ever meet him in person. And I'm just gonna provide a kind of abridged translation of this larger inscription at lower left. It reads, the blessed form of the Shah was ascertained from a group who had seen him, And a likeness, surat, was made, which most believe to be like him. God is the omniscient form giver, al-musawwir. God, in other words, the epigraph declares, is the ultimate artist. Additional inscriptions at the bottom of the painting identify the composition as the work, or amal, of the disciple-born rarity of the age, that is Abul Hasan, son of Aga Reza. The adjoining statement claiming that, quote, because Nowruz, the Persian New Year, was soon approaching, the painting was completed in haste, is not to be taken at face value. Rather, as I discuss in chapter 4, this assertion strategically placed the painter's masterpieces beyond evaluation by the imperial bureaucracy, which both dictated and commodified the Mughal servants' every official function. Abul Hasan's presentation piece was thereby transformed from a mundane exercise into a wondrous, temporally impossible feat. But by foregrounding this assertion, the artist simultaneously relinquished any claims to be the true inventor of the composition. His role in this enterprise amounted to coloring, or completing its coloring, literally again, the work, or amal. Credit for the design, the inscription suggests, belongs to someone else. Among the clues that Abul Hasan's painting portrays an oniric, or dream setting, is the appearance, of course, of angels. The crescent moon and the large sun also suggest the subject's celestial context. A very early Islamic instance of the location of the dream world in the heavens appears in Quran chapter, or Surah 2, verse or ayah 3, which cites the revelation of the prophet Yusuf, the biblical Joseph, that he saw in a dream 11 planets and the sun and the moon. The heavenly setting of Jahangir's vision also corresponds with the many records of Sufi masters' dreams produced across Iran and South Asia during this period. Abul Hasan's painting thus not only establishes the heavenly origins and oniric nature of its subject, but it also equates Jahangir with other sanctified individuals who claim to receive dreams from on high. Heavenly dreams were, of course, vouchsafed to temporal rulers and leaders as well, beyond prophets and Sufis. Abu Bakr, the first of the Rashidun caliphs, was known for his propensity for celestial dreams. Oniric narratives also figure in the numerous histories of the Abbasids, the Timurids, the Ottomans, and the Safavids, showing that the recounting of nocturnal visions was not only a royal prerogative, but was fundamental to the form and structure of political discourses. The oniric narrative could make political messages and acts appear to be preordained or simply matters of God's will. Accounts of dreams were judged to possess as much truth value and thus rhetorical weight as reports of real-life encounters. Dream narratives conceived in this way could serve to bolster a ruler's political legitimacy and that of his dynasty, while, of course, besmirching another's. Further, by laying claim to a visionary experience, a ruler, in our case Jahangir, could demonstrate his piety and proximity to God, to the divine, since, of course, only the most virtuous and devout could receive visions from God. And yet, despite the phantasmagoric appearance and celestial setting of Abul Hasan's painting, as well as the presence of an inscription affirming that the image represents Jahangir's own dream, art historians have resisted interpreting it within a specifically oniric framework. They've instead employed allegoresis, that is the interpretation of literary and artistic expression through allegory, as a primary hermeneutic. But allegory also figures prominently within Islamic theories of dream interpretation. According to Ibn Khaldun, those dreams that are clear and distinct, meaning that the ideas, and I'm quoting here from the Muqaddimah, the ideas perceived in them may be very similar to the pictures by which they're represented. These don't require exegesis. Allegorical dreams, on the other hand, require interpretation because there exists a gap between the dream images and the ideas that they signify. Both the allegorical dream, as it's understood in Islamic Oneira criticism, and literary and artistic allegory encoded imagery to convey an underlying meaning. Dream allegories, however, are distinguished by their presumed source, the angels and the heavens, rather than the artist. Jahangir's dream of subduing his Safavid rival would have thus been judged to originate from neither the painter nor the emperor himself, not directly, but rather from the divine. In his capacity as the creator of Jahangir's dream, depictor. In his capacity as a depictor of Jahangir's dream, Abul Hassan enjoyed the important dual roles of witness to and mediator between the royal, so the temporal, and divine spheres. He both copied and gave material form to the intermediate zone of dreams. He traversed the earthly and the otherworldly, the prefigural and the phenomenal, the past and the present. He was, in this sense, not only an expert in designing and coloring, he was the bridger of worlds. Just as dreams afforded the Mughal emperors divine knowledge of future events, they enabled direct encounters with those who are no longer living. Jahangir, for example, recorded a dream encounter with his deceased father in Ajmer in 1614. In the dream, Akbar recommended clemency for the nobleman known as Khan Azam, whom Jahangir, on the advice of his son Khurram, the future Shah Jahan, had imprisoned in Gwalior Fort. Jahangir's dream meeting with Akbar says as much about his gift of nocturnal insight as it does about the cultivation of Akbar's posthumous reputation as a mystic and a sovereign. It's significant that Jahangir receives guidance not from a Sufi or a prophet, but from his father, who is here treated as a Sufi king possessing prophetic capabilities. In recording his dream, Jahangir participated in a tradition in which living persons claimed exclusive access to deceased luminaries, prophets, scholars, and sheikhs alike. Ibn Arabi maintained that his Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, or Meccan Openings, a multi-volume work dealing with a range of mystical topics, had been inspired by visions of the Prophet Muhammad that he had received while on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Dreamers also drew on their incontestable encounters with the dead to circumvent and expand on established canon. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun, for example, claimed to have met Aristotle in a dream and to have received from him the inspiration to promote translations of Greek texts into Arabic. And many Sufis recorded dream encounters with Khizr, a Quranic prophet believed to possess arcane knowledge of God. For the novice whose goal was to achieve kashf, or unveiling, a crucial step toward enlightenment, Oneiric communication with Khizr and the saints provided direct access to the Alam al-Mithal, the hidden realm that lies beyond phenomenal reality. Dreams facilitated the seeker's apprehension of divine truth. Departing from the strictly textual medium in which royal chroniclers and Sufi communities commonly represented such dream meetings, these two 17th century companion portraits, one of Jahangir, one of Moinuddin Chishti, the Sufi sheikh who famously established the Chishtiya silsila in South Asia during the 12th century, employ the medium of painting and the architecture of the album to record an encounter that could have only occurred in the Mughal sovereign's dreams. The depiction of both figures in strict profile so that when viewed in a codex, they would have confronted each other, as we see here, and the inclusion of similar iconography in each suggests that the two portraits were conceived as a pair. Both, for example, hold celestial orbs pierced with keyholes. Gold inscriptions on the two paintings are not only visually similar, but each also records the name of the Mughal court artist Batitra. The lengthier inscriptions that you see here read, the key to the opening, but the opening or victory of the two worlds is entrusted to your hand. The suggestion here is that the long deceased Sufi saint has bestowed upon Jahangir the keys to the temporal and spiritual worlds. One of the central messages of this pair of portraits is Jahangir's uniquely enlightened status, for he is here depicted as a recipient of a visit and a gift of spiritual largesse from one of the most revered, also long deceased by this point, South Asian Sufis. Following his father's example, Jahangir actively cultivated the appearance of being not only a temporal ruler, but also a Sufi king. His birth name Salim, after Salim Chishti, the Sufi sheikh who had foretold his birth and in whose lodge or hanga the prince was reportedly born, broadcast his affiliation with Sufism and with the Chishti silsila in particular. But the emperor reserved his most profound reverence for Moinuddin Chishti. His displays of devotion escalated in 1613, the year that Jahangir transferred his court to Ajmer. Though this move was almost certainly motivated by the need to counter a military rebellion mounted by Rana Amar Singh I of Mewar, it also afforded the emperor proximity to Moinuddin's dargah, his shrine and burial place in the center of that city. Textual records indicate that Jahangir made at least 9 visits to the dargah during his residency in Ajmer. While suffering from a prolonged illness, Jahangir not only prayed at and gave alms to the dargah, he also committed on his recovery to pierce his earlobes and wear pearl earrings as an external sign of his devotion. Many Mughal courtiers and foot soldiers subsequently pierced their ears in emulation of the emperor. This act cast royal subjects as murids, or disciples, and Jahangir as their peer or master, thereby mirroring the Sufi peer-murid relationship. Jahangir's visionary dreams seem to have flourished most vigorously while he was in residence at Ajmer, and thus in the vicinity of Moinuddin's sanctified body. Jahangir's dream of Akbar, which I mentioned just a minute ago, for example, occurred in Ajmer 4 months after he pierced his ears in devotion to the sheikh. His dream of Shah Abbas also took place around this time, as indicated by the identification of Chashme-i-Nur as the site where it occurred. This pleasure palace, the construction of which was completed around 1614, 1615, lies less than 3 kilometers from Ajmer. The palace's location near the top of a ravine that sits just below the 12th century Targar fort does not quite allow the emperor a view of the sheikh's dargah, the shrine and burial place. But in the Mughal imaginary, the two structures were closely linked, as evidenced by a painting. I'm showing you a detail from it at top right that shows Jahangir at the dargah of Moinuddin. In the background, again, we see in the detail, is a small painted pavilion built alongside waterworks, a detail that helps us to identify the residential structure with Chashme-i-Nur. Chashme-i-Nur's dramatic ravine setting, combined with its spring, fountain, reservoir, and mural-adorned dwellings, provided aesthetic enjoyment, but it was also part of Ajmer's network of sacred Chishti geography, with the shrine of Moinuddin at the center. Saints' bodies, according to Sufi traditions, emanate barakah, or spiritual blessing. Physical proximity to a shrine conveys some of this beneficent force. Sleeping near a dargah could facilitate the apprehension of dreams. Jahangir's career as a visionary dreamer thus was owed rather than merely incidental to his tenure in Ajmer and to his closeness to the Chishti shrine in particular. His proximity to Moinuddin lent him much of the charismatic aura on which he based his identity as a mystical world leader. Springs and other natural water sources, of course, have their own potent associations with dreams, miracles, and healing powers. The Zamzam well in Mecca, which Muslims have long associated with Ibrahim, the biblical Abraham, also with Ishmael and the Prophet Muhammad's grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, is perhaps the most famous example. The autobiography of Babur, the Mughal dynasty's founder, mentions a number of sacred springs. And Humayun, the second Mughal emperor, is known to have celebrated the circumcision of Akbar at a spring near Kabul. Akbar shared his forefathers' interest in water features. Around 1600, he added a commemorative inscription to an open courtyard complex around a sacred spring in Mandu. Jahangir's own patronage of sacred springs was unique to this extent that he resided, if only temporarily, next to, literally almost kind of on top of Chashme-an-Nur. He not only slept by and drank the, quote, water of immortality, end quote, as the spring is characterized in a contemporary inscription on one of the palace complex's rectangular arch frames, but he also conducted business near it. Chashme-an-Nur provided Jahangir a crucial connection with Moinuddin's Sufi daughter, Bibi Hafez Jamal, after whom both the spring and the ravine had been earlier named, thereby extending the Mughal sovereign's association with the sheikh to include the sheikh's esteemed offspring. The sacred waters activated Jahangir's miraculous visionary powers and also brought him closer to his peer. I'm going to advance one slide. This is a detail I had meant to show you, which shows a pavilion also clearly in ruins at Chashme-an-Nur, and that same view again of that pishtak and then the older waterworks overhead, which you of course again see echoed in this detail from a 17th century manuscript painting. The Chitras painted portraits of Moinuddin and Jahangir reinforced the notion that the Chishti saint had sanctioned Jahangir's promotion to Lord of the spiritual and temporal realms. But the paired portraits here function as more than a depiction of a dream encounter. They instantiate it. If we regard the Chitras' works foremost as material objects, specifically as paintings created for use in a codex rather than kind of floating images, it becomes clear that the original arrangement of the images and the inscriptions on opposing pages encourages the viewer to experience them as a direct physical encounter between the two figures who inhabit metaphysically distinct worlds. Moving from right to left, the direction in which Islamic books and Persian script are typically read, we move from the figure of Jahangir and its declaratory inscription, which trails off the painting's upper left corner to appear again on the orb that the sheikh carries in his hands. The repetition of the inscription underscores the fact that the two figures exist in separate realms. Even in a dream, an encounter between Jahangir and Moinuddin Chishti requires bridging the separation between the living and the dead, and so the extra diegetic or divine address must appear twice. The pendant portraits even more function as mediational events, meaning that the Chitra's works and those who view them are agents in a process of transformation between viewer and subject, dreamer and dreamed, living and deceased, earthly and divine. In this sense, the paintings, as much as the dream, are a medium of insight. The narrative conclusion that the inscriptions appear to promise the key to the opening or victory of the two worlds is entrusted to your hand is thus foreclosed. The key is indeed in your hand. It's the paintings themselves. Their utility as instruments of ritual contact and spiritual edification derives as much from their manner of representation, the semiotic interplay of word and image, and their physical arrangement in the album codex, as from their subject matter. Most studies of these portraits and those from the larger group of dream paintings, however, has focused on the iconography largely, meaning that interpretation has rested mainly on the decoding of each work's component parts to arrive at a single overriding message. Although the iconographic approach can shed much light on the significance of these paintings, it neglects the meaning or meanings conveyed by the material and compositional aspects of these objects. Another limitation of the iconographical method is its assumption that analysis necessarily produces a single interpretation when the process of decoding is or can be potentially endless. Take Bachitra's painting of Jahangir seated on the hourglass throne, which is pregnant with signs and symbols, from the portrait of the emperor to the depiction of a Sufi, an Ottoman sultan or diplomat, James I, and a figure in yellow we see at the extreme lower left who represents the artist. Two European-style angels soar above and two more inscribe the bottom of the hourglass with the blessing, "May your life last 1,000 years." Faced with this plethora of symbols and signs, scholars have tended to focus on elements of its iconography that support a single cohesive interpretation. Richard Eddinghausen famously, for example, interpreted the painting's contents as a declaration of Jahangir's preference for spiritual over earthly authority. Yet the painting's abundance of signification precludes this totalizing treatment. What if the painting has no symbolic center? And what if the process of decoding is itself the means of making meaning? The dream painting's iconographic excess and interpretive slippage are central to the identification and function of the images as depictions of dreams that take place in the alam el-mithal, the zone of images that lies between the corporeal and incorporeal realms. It's precisely because the true nature of God is beyond human comprehension, indeed is prefigural, that dreamers receive divine communications by means of encoded and embodied images. While they may exercise their imaginative faculties to perceive these celestial messages, they must draw on the rational faculty to comprehend the phenomenal world when awake to make sense of them. The imaginative faculty, more specifically, uses a mimetic capacity to envision the pictures created and stored by the rational faculty, meaning that the oniric vision comes from God and occurs in a liminal realm, and yet it assumes only forms that the physical eye can perceive. For the Mughal painter, the challenge of representing the emperor's dreams was twofold. He had to depict an unearthly realm that can be grasped only with the imaginative faculty, and he had to do so using images gleaned and manifested by the rational faculty. The iconographically dense nature of the dream paintings may thus represent the artist's attempts to approximate the semiotic phantasmagoria of the oniric realm. The inclusion of distinctively mimetic components, such as Bachitra's relatively faithful copy of a copy, not this particular painting, but a copy of a portrait of James I, follow in the same vein by explicitly replicating the sensory images on which the imaginative faculty draws. The artist doesn't exactly represent the dream and the dream world. He instead models the oniric realm's own modes of figuration, namely mimesis and semiosis, to create the painting's dense field of encoded imagery. To complete the dream painting, then, it must be decoded. But the viewer's or dreamer's fullest apprehension of the vision arises not from the translation of these symbols per se, but from the very act of decoding. In her study of visionary practices among Sufi communities in South Asia, Marcia Hermanson argues that encoded dreams and visions function in effect as cognitive tools. But she underscores the importance of the process of interpretation rather than the fact of the dream alone in advancing spiritual illumination. For Hermanson, the process of thinking in symbolic systems becomes a trigger for visionary experience. Unraveling the system of signification in the paintings of Jahangir's dream can thus produce a visionary experience on a par with the dream itself. The dream painting's surplus of signification, in other words, may have been by design, the aim being to at first confound and then elucidate. The point lies not only in the meaning of the images, again, but also in the discerning of their meaning. In fashioning his own dense array of symbols, the Mughal painter of imperial dreams embraced a kind of symbolic thinking that contrary to the assumptions inherent to iconographic representation, is neither unconsciously nor intuitively adduced, but instead results from calculated consideration. Although God is the ultimate encoder of the emperor's dream, it's the artist who gives the dream material form. And in doing so, the painter guides the viewer to perceive the oniric vision as a beguiling display of disparate forms. The Mughal painters' amplification of the compositional foreground and their incorporation of European objects and images also identify the dream paintings as other and otherworldly, an effect that's heightened due to its dramatic departure from what was then, or very recently, the manuscript painting convention, as this comparison with an illustration from a history of Akbar's reign, completed in the 1590s, shows. The dream painting's use of illusionistic modeling alongside representational strategies that emphasize abstraction and flatness, furthermore, as Kavita Singh has insightfully observed, serves to draw the eye into the composition. This exercise does not lead to cathartic cognizance, however, but to wonder and then confusion. Questions follow. Where do these visions take place? Why does Jahangir stand on a lion? What is the meaning of the European hourglass's inclusion in Vichitra's work? And so the circuitous, endless journey to divine meaning in form begins. But the power of these works lies not only in their visual excess and entangled temporalities, but also in the status they confer on their makers. The works center their painters as the innovators of a new type of instrumental painting that mediated between the realms of the image and the imagination, while maintaining the pretense that the actual creators of the images are Jahangir and ultimately God. The Mughal emperor is ascribed a perspicacious way of seeing. The paintings encourage the viewer to attempt a similar kind of penetrating vision. External seeing, after all, can illuminate one's inner visions. The irony is that the painter who fashions the entire picture styles himself a mere copyist. He executes the work, the amal, of coloring God's design as received by Jahangir, the true agent of insight. The dream paintings afforded artists the opportunity to make bold proclamations about their dual roles as court servants and creators. In his depiction of Jahangir seated on an hourglass throne, Vichitra placed his signature on the emperor's footstool, a humbling, if also self-promoting gesture. The epigraph identifying the artist as the sincere slave is also disingenuously self-denigrating. He appears again, this time pictorially, at lower left, holding up the emperor, for the emperor, a painting of an elephant, 2 horses, and a man who bows submissively. The elephant may represent an imperial gift. The bowing man, note that he, like the artist, also wears a yellow stitched robe. On the other hand, appears to stand in for the artist, who is too preoccupied with the presentation of that painting to make obeisance himself. In depicting himself and his offering in this recursive way, Vichitra perhaps sought to ensure that the overall painting would be perceived not as an affront to the creative authority of the emperor or of God, but instead as a statement of devotion to his sovereign. A pair of works mounted in the Jahangir album offers another meditation on the contrivance of pictorial representations. And when I call these a pair, they're actually 2 paintings executed on separate supports that have then been mounted together and painted over to look almost like a seamless composition, but they were created originally as 2 separate works. The image on the right, and I'm talking about the detail there on the left, depicts an artist painting an illustration of a hunt. The illusion of the painting within a painting is, however, undercut by the truncation of the topmost edge of the painting and the board on which it rests. The illustration's unfinished appearance only affirms its constructed nature and also points to image making as durational, right? It takes time, it's a process. The mussel shells resting on the board are empty of the bright paints that they're meant to hold. Their lack of color contrasts with the colorful scene of the artist and his surroundings, and again, calls attention to the artificiality of the painting process. The image at left concludes the metapictorial sequence by juxtaposing an image of a Christian icon with that of a distant and fanciful landscape. Like his counterpart, the Mughal artist, likely Keshav Das, is depicted, or more likely has depicted himself, seated with his paintbrush in right hand. The small shells on the floor beside him are filled with many differently colored paints, yet the image he's working on contains only blue wash and flesh tones. The warmer and more vivid colors held by the shells, however, match the artist's costume and the striped woven rug in the immediate foreground, as if to suggest that the subject of the work has painted the very composition in which he appears. He focuses his attention on the task at hand, the completion of what may be an image of the Virgin Mary, and thus an evocation of the miraculous portrait of the Virgin that Catholics attribute to the hand of St. Luke. Her appearance here may have served to provide additional grounds for reflection on the painter's vocation, for here too, the depiction of the Virgin is revealed to be but an ordinary picture, unfinished at that, made by non-saintly hands. The incomplete Marian painting is counterposed with, in fact, it literally cuts through the representation of the deeply recessed landscape. The illusionism of this landscape is rendered void by its framing within the album page. But the figures are presented as residing in the same space, in proximity to one another. The viewer must accept that the landscape in the window belongs to some other spatial order altogether. Is it a figment of the artist's imagination? In which case, which artist exactly? Is it instead meant to be a depiction of a mural, or is it just paint on a page? Since all images ultimately come from God, the painting of images, Keshav Das, Abul Hassan, and Bachitra seem to suggest, is a sanctified gift rather than an artistic invention. The problem is that they and their colleagues were too effective in their self-effacement, where they have left past and present viewers with the impression that neither their works nor their aspirations were, in fact, their own. Thank you. Thanks for being such a lovely audience, too.
Yael, thank you so much for that brilliant talk, and I'm sure like all of us can't wait to get our hands on the book now. We have time for questions if you're happy to take them.
Yes.
So if anybody has questions, please feel free.
Thank you for that. It was truly refreshing and enlightening.
Thank you.
Very close. I wanted to get your sense on food. One is, obviously the Mughal emperors, we're looking at the great Sufi masters to derive their own spiritual legitimacy. Wow, that makes very proud. To what extent do you think the Mughals, especially Jahangir, also competed with and even with
Okay. Should I repeat that question for, I don't know if they can hear online. The question.
Probably a good idea.
So there's a question from the audience, for anyone who's out there, about whether the emperor, specifically Jahangir, might be perceived as having sort of been in competition with Sufis, and I think, and the prophet, in fact, himself. I think they would have been very conscious of towing that line. and not have taken that a step too far. But I think it was, in Akbar's case especially, I think, there were, transgressions that were made, but always within the bounds of what is Islamic. And it calls into question, sorry?
Ilahi was what? Ilahi was a big departure, wasn't it?
Well, there have been very recent re-examinations of this Dini Ilahi or the Tawhid Ilahi, actually by someone, a historian who's in the room here, Corinne Lefebvre, and that, actually critical sort of examination of the textual sources and conversations ascribed to Jahangir suggest it was within the bounds of what we understood, or a kind of capacious sense of Islam. It was not a kind of independent religion. It was very, very consciously modeled off of a Sufi silsila. And in fact, I talk about in the book that these tokens, these shas, that both Akbar and Jahangir distributed to disciples, but apparently much more broadly than just the disciples, as Sir Thomas Roe was had been gifted one or came into possession of one. That certain texts actually describe these the sort of process of being kind of inculcated in this discipleship in terms that are very, very close to language used to describe Sufi lineages and practices. So I don't really, it's actually a kind of mirroring and emulation rather than a sort of rejection or competition. But it's an interesting question. I think, really we need to look at.
Objection, as much as the Mughals, especially Jahangir, viewed themselves with the Billah with the columns. So that's where it went.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think in a kind of like in a sense that was largely permissible, not that there were not members or people outside of the court that did not find, that disagreed. There certainly were. Not everyone was kind of on board with this. But I would say it was very firmly kind of within the sort of bounds, discourses, the mold of a Sufi tariqa. Yeah. Yeah.
We'll go here and then.
Sorry, thanks.
Hi.
That was one. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I appreciated your discussion of Islam, excuse me,
Mm.
and how this was a sort of common feature of Sufi lineages and also royal houses and then it overlaps on actual genealogy.
Yeah.
And then looking at initiated dreams as well. So dreams is very important to the master relationship. So I'm wondering, do you have any evidence of painters actually working the same way? Like, did you have to be initiated in a workshop or that kind of thing? Like, I do a diagram of the network.
Yeah.
Was it kind of diffuse, or was there actually a concept of like a linear? Maybe you wouldn't have access to that information, but because it's so there in music, I'm wondering if it's there.
It's such a great question. So I'm just going to repeat an abridged version of this really great question for those of us who are with us online. It had to do with whether artists, painters themselves, like musicians actually did, actually kind of modeled communities of discipleship themselves. And in a sense, yes. So in the period that I cover in the book, it's especially pronounced in terms of the sort of familial genealogies. And so artists are very, very keen to pronounce their, who they are the sons of, the nephews of. And this actually then becomes materialized, enshrined in the context of this famous imperial album, which I found really, really fascinating. We've thought about this Gulshan Jahangir album as an expression of the sovereign, in this case Jahangir's, own sort of rulership, right? And his status as this kind of sanctified sovereign. But the artists embed themselves within the pages. in really fascinating ways where they kind of touch up their father's own work, where they inscribe works that their teachers had committed. So it's not exactly, I think, what you're asking, but certainly in later periods, you do get this whole idea of a lineage and the sort of discursive trace of that lineage, so that it's important to actually write down. I'm talking about sort of later decades, centuries across the Mughal Empire, but also in other regions that are part of the Mughal Empire as well, but not Mughal artists, where it's really, really important to kind of put down on paper, who you're descended from, and that you're part of this family. So it is actually kind of interestingly like the musician's Karana. Yeah, great question. And I think there was a question here too.
Question is about
Mm.
his father, he was here, but the next he was here.
Mm.
Many historians say that Jahangir didn't even
Mhm.
he switched his belief from
Mhm.
religion.
Mhm.
So my question is mainly about Ajam. He was
Mhm.
greater Sufis than Chishti. For example, Kojwiri
Mhm.
that had much
Mhm.
related.
Mhm.
Even Chishti himself sent Killa
Mhm.
40 days meditation
Mhm.
in the shrine of Kojwiri
Mhm.
before going to.
Mhm.
So the point is that why Chishti when
Yep.
Kojwiri?
Okay. Yeah.
And the third part of my question is about things.
Yeah.
Was he just making it?
Yeah.
Or gaining legitimacy because Chishti was one of the greatest Sufis
Yeah.
in India, even at that time.
Yeah.
And he's the greatest. Even at that time, he had many followers.
Mm.
So was it because politics that he wanted to get the support of followers of Chishti or go to the people that follow?
So I'm going to mainly focus on the latter two questions. One, why the Chishtis? And secondly, was Jahangir just kind of making up these dreams? So why the Chishtis? Partly it has to do with the descendants of Muinuddin Chishti. That is his sort of professional, but also familial descendants, actively cultivating a relationship with the Mughals. So it actually goes two ways. So I mentioned, of course, the important role that Salim Chishti plays, and I think is a mutual relationship. It's not unidirectional. The Chishtis, of course, are not the only Sufis who seek patronage from the Mughal emperors, and whom the Mughals also are kind of cultivating some kind of, mutually beneficial connection with. So maybe I'll just leave it at that. The question about, is he just making this up? We have no way to know, but I think, yeah, maybe, probably. Yeah. The idea that, I hope to, my intention was to establish in this presentation I gave is that the discourse of the dream is a really kind of powerful, it provides a sort of architecture to transmit positions and messages that cannot be very easily contested, right? And not to say that, he pronounces, I have this dream, and everyone's like, okay, that's the written word. But it couched in that fashion, and then obviously kind of tied to the spiritual geography of Ajmer and the kinds of other activities that he's engaged in. I believe the dream, and he's not obviously the first, this is common, it's not even exclusively Islamic hate, right? This is a sort of common discursive instrument that's used by spiritual temporal leaders across the board. In a way, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter whether he had the dream or not. You know? Yeah.
Congratulations on
Thank you.
Will, when we read it, we will say fantastic. I was really taken by your question about dream paintings, which only started calling you after your work. But you know, this idea when you were preparing the dream painting to the Akbar number,
Yeah.
and this process of navigating through the dream, or really being disoriented and then sort of finding your way through it.
Yeah.
I wonder whether or not you really see it as a rupture between manuscripts that are slower, that are, you know, are narrative, and the dream painting, or you might be able to historicize the dream painting using, think of tantra, we can think of all sorts of other viewing practices that are slow, that require us to pick apart something. So I wonder whether or not we might have thoughts on what these artists can have.
Okay, so I'm again going to summarize the question, which is whether the dream paintings, as I've described them, as a kind of rupture, at least from earlier Akbari narrative manuscript illustration traditions, if there are other kind of correspondences and other painting, book painting, wall paint, I mean, other kinds of. And I think it's a great question, and one that I certainly don't cover in this book because I'm really kind of in the Mughal world. I don't want to sort of, I hesitate to sort of try to imagine what these artists may have had access to or were thinking about, you know, whether they were schooled in or familiar with, you know, the traditions of the Kalpa Sutra, in which dreams figure prominently. I would want really concrete evidence to sort of forge those connections, but I think it's there. I think, and it's an interesting idea that, and yet still, I think quite unusual. You know, one challenge is we don't really know the original context for which these objects were made, intended in the early 17th century. As some of you will know, they live today in an album that was actually assembled in Iran in the mid 18th century. I conjecture that they were made aspirationally by these artists to be presented on these, you know, very kind of heady ritual occasions like Nowruz, with the hope that they would be sort of accepted and kind of absorbed and mounted into an album. So I say all that to say, I think in the context, when you put something into an album, which it's not like the album lacks an arc, but it doesn't have that kind of continuous narrative arc. It kind of starts to function, you know, images, but also calligraphies as fragments. They start to function on a kind of different level. And that's why, you know, I've been thinking about these as really fragments. So I think it's a great question. I think there's a kind of web of connections and there is that sort of like symbolical thinking that I propose is operative here, that is definitely operative in so many other traditions, but somehow kind of like coalescing into this like single object. Yeah, but lots to think about. Thank you for that. Yeah, Jake? Yeah.
I'm just curious to know, I mean, it does seem shown several things that were there.
Yeah.
And I think we might on the margins, not the outer ones you showed.
Yeah.
Clearly done in the inner margin.
Yeah.
That indicate production.
Mm-hmm.
So is it a mixed, are they facing, always facing?
Okay, so again, I'll summarize the question, which I think is about whether we can identify other sort of oppositional binary pairs, mainly by looking at the inner decorated margins, which we assume, and I think that's correct, that they are of 17th century Mughal production origin. And furthermore, you know, could we extend that to the calligraphies?
Calligraphies are also.
Yeah, I think there absolutely is. One challenge that precludes that kind of study, one with these particular, the set of the Jahangir dream paintings, again, is that they were recontextualized in a really interesting way. I think it's really, really important, the mid-18th century Iranian recontextualization of them. But the calligraphies too in that particular album, which as you know, is called the St. Petersburg album, are not actually from the, I mean, they're later. They're 18th century Iranian calligraphies. Now, you also have the Jahangir Gulshan album. The majority of those calligraphies are, of course, of mid-16th century, early 16th century origin by Mir Ali. And that is also a really, really interesting question. But we don't have, I don't personally have access to a corpus of those to do that kind of comparison. So those of you who are unaware, this is an album that was most likely taken to Iran in around the 1740s by Nadir Shah, who looted the Mughal imperial court in Delhi. And then actually things were done to that album too, since in Tehran. Most of it lives still in Tehran. There are chunks of folios that live in Berlin. There are folios scattered around to multiple collections. And there has been actually a team of scholars for some time now whose objective was really to kind of virtually put all the folios back together. And that would be really, really fascinating. But I'm not going to wait decades for that to happen. But hopefully someday, I mean, the hope is, I hope that someday we can, at least through, you know, high resolution photographs, start to kind of unpack some of those sorts of resonances, especially because unlike the image sides of those folios, which range from 17th century and date to 16th century, are Mughal, are Shaybanid, they come from a variety of sources. The calligraphies really are like, you know, one family's like collection, his son, right? Muhammad Bakir, who brings them to the Mughal court. So, you know, that's really, really interesting. I'm not sure I exactly answered your question, but, you know, this is kind of, these are the challenges. It's also the fun. I mean, you know, those of us who work on these kinds of objects that are portable and can be, you know, and were, and still are cut up and taken apart. Yeah, thanks.
Hey, I think now we should let Yael catch her breath and have a drink. And yeah, first.
Can I just, so, you know, I'm not really a natural salesperson, but I did want to mention, if you're interested in buying the book, I really, really would like for you to have a discount. These are codes that you can use both in the US, outside of the US, in Europe, Africa, and Asia. I have my own, I just have one copy of this that the press had FedEx to me, and I'm happy, you know, you can to pass it around or something. Yeah, but thanks so much. Yeah.